I think they are quite good. There's a lot of I would say several years ago, if you talk to somebody in San Francisco, they would say they seems pretty safe, but yeah, they kind of drive kind of jerkily. Sometimes you're not sure what they're going to do. They like stop a lot, and so one level is like make sure it won't hit anything, but then another level is like make it kind of smoothly integrate into the flow of traffic and do kind of what you expect. And they're getting pretty good at that. I'm sure there's still room for improvement.
Hello and welcome to Why Is This Happening with me, your host, Chris Hayes. A few weeks ago, we published a conversation about the book Life After Cars, which was, I thought, a really interesting conversation and also provoked a lot of really interesting feedback from people. I think it's one of those topics because it's so embedded in how we live our lives, the time we spend in cars, how we get to places, what our commutes look like, how much traffic we're in, how we get around, the topography of the location we find ourselves in, that it got a lot of responses. And I got a really interesting email from a journalist and actually previous with podcast named Timothy Lee, who I've known for years. And Tim has been reporting on economics and tech and policy for like over a decade. And he's been doing really interesting stuff about automated driving, self-driving cars. He wrote me this really interesting email that sort of triggered a whole bunch of questions about the topic we were talking about driving and life in cars, and what the next chapter of that whole conversation might be like, particularly because this technology of self-driving cars is one of those technologies that for a long time felt like vaporware. It felt like, oh, it's just around the corner. Oh, 6 months from now, we're going to figure this out. And people were saying this for years, I think maybe even a decade. And there were huge headlines about big money being invested into startups who are going to figure this out, and quietly fizzled. And as we've all been paying a lot of attention to AI and having a set of really interesting conversations about, like, is it a bubble? Is it a bust? Is it going to transform life as we know it? Is it going to end in something like nuclear war where we get subjugated by the machines? As we've been having this set of conversations about AI, what's happened, I think, a little under the radar is that the self-driving technology has kind of arrived. It has matured. It isn't 6 months from now. It isn't speculative. It's operating. And as we're going to talk about in this conversation, operating at a pretty shockingly high level. We'll get into some of the details. And so now this thing that for a long time really felt futuristic and speculative and maybe a gimmick seems like it's kind of here. And there's a whole bunch of really profound, interesting questions about what does it mean if we have self-driving cars at scale, automated driving cars at scale. What does it mean for our laws, for regulation, for safety, for transportation, for jobs? And so I thought, hey, this is a great opportunity to talk to Tim Lee, who was on the podcast about 3 years ago talking about his own personal experience as a dad who kind of during COVID sort of decided to opt out and spend more time sort of as a parent, and talking about that decision he made. He's been writing the Understanding AI newsletter all about developments in AI, and he's been covering this topic of automated driving really closely. So Tim, great to have you in the program.
Hey, Chris, it's great to be back on.
So let's just start with let's start with where this technology is right now, and in the context of a sense of a lot of us had who covered it or sort of casually looked at it of like magic beans being promised that didn't actually turn out. Why is now different? Like, what has happened in the last, say, 6 months or year such that you can say pretty confidently that it's looking like a solved problem? Like, we've figured out how to have automated driving.
Yeah, so I've been covering this topic since around 2017 is when I started covering it on, probably a weekly basis. And back then there was a lot of hype around it. In 2016, I think Ford said that they'd have a vehicle with no steering wheel by 2021, which obviously didn't happen.
Right.
And so back then they had a lot of prototypes that like worked pretty well. It seemed like it was pretty close, and people were getting really excited. And it just took longer to figure out than people thought it would. A bunch of those startups that were around in the teens went out of business. But Waymo, which is Google's self-driving company, they just keep plugging away at the problem. They launched a driverless service, a very small driverless service in Phoenix in 2020. And then they did San Francisco in 2023, LA and Austin in 2024, Atlanta this year, and they just announced they're starting driverless testing in 5 more cities in Texas and Florida in the coming weeks. And so in 2026, we're going to have at least 10, probably as many as 15 cities that have working, fully driverless, open to the public, no wait list services that anybody can just hop in and get a ride with no driver.
I had my first experience with that in San Francisco when I was on book tour. And there was a very funny moment where we were talking about it. My friend was like, let me call you one home just so you have the experience. So he called me when I got in, and at the end, when I got out of the car, out of total force of muscle memory and habit, I was like, thanks. Like I said, I caught myself saying that to the empty driver's seat. And it was such a strange moment, like the ghost machine there. And also felt kind of profound in a way. Like I was left thinking about that interaction because it was the most futuristic, this is what the robot future looks like interaction that I've had by far.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. I think as people get used to it, their kind of perception shifts pretty quickly. I mean, this happened with me my first time. I also did it for the first time in San Francisco. First time I like had my phone out and I like videoed the whole first drive and was waiting for it to like make a mistake, and it didn't really. Did a little bit the second one, but still wasn't that exciting. By the third or fourth one, I was like, oh, should I like pull out a book and read? Because it's just a very careful driver. It drives exactly like a person, except there's not a person there. And it very quickly goes from like, oh man, this is amazing science fiction, to okay, it's a ride like any other ride. It just happens that I have a person in the driver's seat. And it just becomes very routine. And so there's people in San Francisco that just commute to work in a driverless car every day. It costs about the same as an Uber or Lyft. It works basically the same. And I think people right now, in parts of the country that don't have it there's still a lot of fear or confusion, or people just aren't aware of it. But when it comes to your city, it starts to seem very normal pretty quickly.
I wonder if we could talk about the tech a little bit, about why it was a more difficult problem to solve than people thought in, say, 2016 and 2017, and what Waymo has figured out that has allowed them to get to where they are now.
So it's just that going from 99% accurate to 99% accurate to 99.9, 99.999, each extra 9 is just a ton of engineering work. And partly it's because when you get onto a real street, there's just lots of things that happen once in a while that you don't encounter until you've done 1,000 or 100,000 or a million miles. For example, one thing that Waymo had a lot of struggles with in 2023 was interacting with emergency vehicles. So when they were testing with safety drivers, if they came up to a crash site or a fire scene, the safety driver would just take over and drive around it, and it wasn't a big deal. But then when they're fully driverless, they actually have to handle that driverlessly. And the vehicles do have the ability to kind of phone home and ask for help. Nobody's driving with a steering wheel, but it can say, hey, is it safe for me to go here? Some things like that. But still, you had situations where a Waymo would kind of get confused and would like block a fire truck, or it would not recognize a hose and drive over a hose. And those sort of things, again, it might only happen once every million miles. And so at a small scale, you kind of don't realize that, oh, this is something we really need to take seriously. And so there's this iterative loop where they scale up a little bit, they encounter a bunch of new problems that they hadn't encountered before, they do some more engineering work, scale up a little bit more. They've just been going through that loop for 10 years now. Every year they're 2 or 3 times bigger than they were before. And now they're still, so I think the one remaining thing, they just launched on freeways, which was difficult. It's pretty easy to do pretty well on freeways, but if you screw up on a freeway, it's really, really bad. And so until like last month, literally, they only did surface streets. Now they're starting to do freeways. The last thing they haven't done yet is snow. And so the north, like Chicago and Boston, I think will be quite a while, probably be a couple more years, because they have to figure out. So they're just kind of working down the checklist of here's all the difficult situations we have to handle, checking out one at a time. And it just takes a long time to figure them all out.
Yeah. And I guess at one level, what I'm hearing from you there is that there's no substitute for experience and in terms of engineering and design. Like, you can think of these things in advance, but really what has to happen is you have to go out and do them, experience them, try to solve them, see if that works, and keep doing that.
And part of it is kind of machine learning tricks. You have like better networks or whatever, but also part of it is just other kind of organizational stuff. For example, one thing they did in San Francisco is the San Francisco first responders have a way to geofence that area and say, like, this is a fire scene, like try to go around this area. And so driverless cars will just go away from that. And just doing the training and the negotiation and the building the technology, eventually I assume they'll try to standardize this so every city has something like this. There's a lot of little problems like that. Another thing they've had is like first responders want to be able to talk to the kind of operator who like runs the Waymo and figuring out, do we use the external microphones? What's the like protocol for like dialing that up? up? How do we train? Like, there's lots of little problems like that. They're not like technology problems per se, but you can't start testing those until you actually, because cops are not going to come into your office and do like trial runs. They're going to actually do it when they actually encounter your vehicle. And so there's lots of practical experience they have to have, and then they have to do engineering work once they like encounter a problem they have to solve.
I mean, that gets to what part of what's so interesting about this as a problem is that driving isn't a technological undertaking. It's a social, legal, cultural, habitual, communicative undertaking. Like when you're driving, you're communicating with other drivers, you're behaving in certain ways under certain social expectations of that behavior that are both regulated by the law, but also by custom. There's official law on how people actually drive. You're dealing with etiquette. You're like, no, you go first. No, you go first. So like all of those, when you think about what a sophisticated undertaking it is, or communicating with emergency vehicles, right? That's a sort of communicative regulatory problem. It is kind of wild that they've gotten as good as they've gotten.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think they are quite good. There's a lot of I would say several years ago, if you talk to somebody in San Francisco, they would say they seems pretty safe, but yeah, they kind of drive kind of jerkily. Sometimes you're not sure what they're going to do. They like stop a lot, and so one level is like make sure it won't hit anything, but then another level is like make it kind of smoothly integrate into the flow of traffic and do kind of what you expect. And they're getting pretty good at that. Although I'm sure there's still room for improvement.
One of the things I was struck by when I rode in it was that it was a very smooth, cautious ride. It was a careful but smooth driver. So not like heavily braking, but also not going not going fast, not rushing anything. We now have, we can talk later a little bit about Tesla, but Waymo, my understanding, has been relatively transparent with their safety data. We can actually see it, right? We know what their safety data is, and the safety data we have is like pretty mind blowing. Can you walk us through it so far?
Yeah, absolutely. So, top level, it's about 80% less likely to get into crashes than human drivers. And I think the most useful safety data is looking at the most severe crashes, either ones that cause a serious injury or crashes that trigger an airbag, because those are ones that almost always are reported to police. Because actually the tricky thing is we know exactly how often the self-driving cars crash. What we don't know is how often do people crash, because often you get into a minor fender bender and you'll look, it's fine, you'll drive off, you won't call the police, you won't report to your insurance company. But the most serious are crashes, the one that involve an injury or towing a car away. We know those. And so for those kind of crashes, it's about 80% less. The Waymo cars crash about 80% less. And then if you go and look at the individual crashes, which I've done because Waymo has to report every crash to federal regulators, a very large majority of those are pretty clearly the fault of another human driver. There's a ton of Waymo getting rear-ended. In many of those, Waymo's not even moving. It's just like stop at a light, gets rear-ended. There are several where the Waymo stopped and the passenger opens the door and like hits a bicycle. So it's like the passenger should have been paying attention. And Waymo does have like an alarm to like to warn people, but sometimes they don't notice. Anyway, so if you look at the crashes, there's basically none where it's like clearly like the self-driving software messed up and hit somebody. There's some where it's like maybe they could have handled it a little better, but most of them are other driver was being a moron and hits the Waymo. And so I think if every vehicle on the road was a Waymo, I think it's very likely we'd have a 90+% reduction in the number of crashes in the cities that they're operating, which is San Francisco and Phoenix are the two where we have the most data.
I mean, that's crazy. And at first level, it seems, I want to be skeptical here. There's no reason to think like they're hiding data from, is there any book cooking that's happening, or is there a way that they could be cooking the books that we should be skeptical of the data?
So I've done all the reporting I can. I mean, the underlying data of when the crashes happen, that comes from Waymo. It kind of has to come from Waymo because they're the ones that know about it. I think it's unlikely that they're failing to report serious crashes because I've looked, the ones they have reported, a lot of them have media coverage. And so if they caused a crash and didn't report it, like I think somebody would notice.
Yeah.
The other source of information that I think is very helpful is insurance data, because if a Waymo were to crash into you, you would report it to your insurance company. And there's like a big database of all insurance claims that the insurance companies use to kind of settle up with one another. And so Waymo partnered with a reinsurance company called Swiss Re and looked at this data, and they found a similar thing, that it's 80 to 90% fewer claims against the Waymo by other drivers than a typical human driver would in the same cities where Waymo operates.
Wow. Yeah, so that's sort of two layers of data, right? That we've got the other people making claims, we've got the Waymo self-reported data. They're sort of syncing up. I mean,
Mhm.
at one level, my first thought is, okay, if the Waymo is never going to be drunk and it's never going to be high, it's never going to be on any intoxicant, it's never going to be sleepy, it's never going to be looking at its phone, and it's never going to be 18 years old. And I guess I would
Or
be
90 years old.
or 90 years old. And I would be willing to bet, and I don't know this data off the top of my head, but if you took those categories out of human caused crashes, you might see something like a 70 or 80% reduction. I don't know what the number is, but you would
Yeah.
clearly reduce accidents by a lot if you just took those instances off the top.
Yep, that's right. And I think there's reason to think Waymo may also be kind of anticipating some of the bad behavior by other drivers. One of the things, so Waymo used to have a competitor called Cruise that was GM's self-driving company. And in 2023, when they were kind of competing most aggressively, Cruise had a number of incidents where it would go into an intersection and a human driver would hit it from the other direction. And the human driver had a red light, so they were clearly in the wrong. But Cruise maybe could have anticipated that and not gone into the intersection. Waymo has a very impressively low rate of those kind of intersection crashes, which makes me think they're probably, when they come up to an intersection, they're slowing down a little bit, using their sensors to see anybody coming. And if they see somebody coming, even if they have the green light, the Waymo will slow down. To get to like an 80% reduction, I think you really do not only have to stop all of your crashes that you would have caused, but also anticipate the mistakes other drivers would have made and prevent a lot of those. And they seem to be doing that.
The thing you just said before, that if we had full self-driving cars, we can anticipate like massive reductions. It also seems to me the case that if you just had, computer drivers, robot drivers, you would be reducing also all of this uncertainty as well. And you could kind of collaborate and coordinate the way they interact with each other a little more smoothly, such that you could see huge gains over at the population level that might even be bigger than what you're getting in the mixed environment of humans and machines.
Yeah, I think that's right. But I do think like a large majority of the crashes are, like you were saying, are people who are really behaving badly.
Right.
Like,
Yes.
I
They're
think
just driving. Yes.
Two average drivers are very unlikely to hit each other. It's like often both of them are doing something really bad, or one of them is doing so there's been only two fatal crashes, and one of them was a Waymo was stopped at a line of cars in like urban San Francisco, and some guy comes 100 miles an hour and hits a vehicle, not Waymo, hits a different vehicle, causes like a pileup, and somebody in a different vehicle dies. And so a lot of the crashes are just like the most serious crashes are something like that, where it's just like nothing the other person could have done. And it's just like extreme bad behavior. And Waymo can't like totally prevent that from happening, but in some cases it might be able to anticipate it or, take actions to mitigate the harm.
I started off the conversation talking about AI, and maybe this is such a dumb question, but I'm going to ask it anyway at the risk of sounding ignorant. Like, I'm not really quite sure what we even mean by AI anymore. It's a very capacious category. Clearly, when we're talking about Waymo, we're not talking about large language models. We're not talking about predictive tokens. We're not talking about generating text or video. But we are talking about some sophisticated level of calculation of inputs that feels, judgment-like, intelligence-like. Like, would you call what's powering it AI?
Oh, absolutely. So actually, this has been a little bit of weird. The introduction of large language models has been a little bit weird for me, because before they came along, AI was this big category of like, people would say obviously self-driving cars is a type of AI. Since ChatGPT came along, people started using AI just to describe like chatbots. And so people are like, why are you covering self-driving cars on your AI newsletter? I'm like, because it's obviously AI. So I think in some ways, people's like conception of that has narrowed. But it's also the case that Waymo's technology and the industry as a whole has actually been moving. It's not large language models per se, but the underlying architecture is called the transformer. It's about, so an LM, it predicts the next word. And in a similar way, there's a piece of Waymo's software that tries to predict the next action. It sees the interaction of the cars almost as a conversation, where each car kind of makes a move based on the positions of the other cars. And part of the way they train their system is that they collect a ton of data of different cars interacting with each other, and then they train a model to say, given this set of cars, what do you predict the car will do? Whether you trade it, if they guessed it right, it gets a reward. If it guessed it wrong, it gets discouraged from doing that. And so it ends up actually has a similar architecture to LLMs. And this is part of the reason for the greater smoothness is they used to have more kind of hard-coded, like if this, do that kind of programming.
Right.
And they've shifted to something more like an LLM, where they actually are trying to learn from real human drivers to say, what would the average human do in this situation? That doesn't always work, but often it gets you a smoother, kind of better riding experience.
That's really interesting, right? Because, right, if you were to ask me, like, okay, well, how would you code a self-driving car? There's one level at which it almost lends itself, right, to a kind of basic instructional programming, because you could say, we code humans into how to do this when you learn to drive. Like, if you see the red stop sign, then you stop. If you want to make a right, you hit your turn signals. But in the real world of the insane number of variables and complexities, something that's working more like an LLM or like in this sort of predictive modeling and trained over and over is going to get you something like what we have now with Waymo, which is a good human driver.
Yeah, because there's some cases where you can have a clear program. You can say, if you're about to run into another object, stop. Like, that's a clear kind of rule you can program. But if you think about something like merging into a lane, there's a lot of subtlety of you go first or the other guy go first. And if you try to write like a set of like binary rules to say, here's the steps you follow, it'd be really hard to do. Whereas if you think about it as a data fitting problem of like, what's the most similar situation?
Merge. This is a successful merge in the data set. And now we want you to go do a successful merge. No, that wasn't right. No, this is right. Iterate. You get this match between, so that it kind of comes to learn because of the way the sort of neural network is working, right? What the connections are, what a successful merge is.
Yeah. And so that's very similar to how LLMs are trained.
Is the software improvement, like we said in the beginning, you were saying that some of this is like a scaling thing and just raw data, which again is really a huge question on the LLM front, right? That's why it's why they're building these enormous data centers, right? They have to scale. Is that really the breakthrough here, or has the software gotten more sophisticated?
I would say it's both. There's definitely a flywheel where as Waymo gets more experience, they have more data, so they can train their models. They can get a little better, which means then it's economical to scale up, and so that process has been going for 15 years now. And definitely that's a factor in Waymo's approach. But then, like I was saying, there's also other things like how do we interact with first responders, where there's probably not an LLM or a like neural network approach. You just have to. There's like
coordinate
bureaucratic
with them.
stuff, coordinate with them, or build some kind of like user interface, or there's lots of other stuff you have to do. But yeah, a big piece of it is using kind of more sophisticated neural networks with more data and more compute.
You talked. Let's talk a little bit about the sort of cultural experience or reactions to Waymo. I mean, I think there is, right, when it's introduced, it feels like something futuristic, possibly dystopian, cursed, haunted. There have been, these viral videos where Waymos got like stuck in loops with each other. There was one where they were in a parking lot and they were all like honking at each other and people were losing their minds. And you can imagine like there is a little bit of, Terminator Rise of the Robots feel that this gives us. In San Francisco and Phoenix, like, can you describe if there's an arc to what sort of like political, cultural, local receptivity to this as a project has been now that they've been functioning for a while?
So I think there was a pretty big ideological or partisan dimension to this. I think in Arizona, it was pretty chill. When Waymo started operating in the 20 teens, I think Doug Ducey, the Republican, was the governor. And so they were kind of rolled out the red carpet. They had a very permissive regulatory framework, pretty much let Waymo do what they want. I think I don't think there was a lot of controversy about it. People just kind of got used to it. San Francisco has been much more tumultuous. So in California, self-driving cars are regulated at the state level, and Governor Newsom has been pretty friendly to them. And so Waymo has had the legal right to roll out. But there has been several stages of testing and permits and stuff. But then the city leaders are very unfriendly to Waymo and have done whatever they can, which is not very much, to kind of slow them down. And they complained about it. They petitioned the state to slow down their deployment and so forth. And that's partly, I think, for safety concerns, which I think are kind of misguided, but also labor concerns. You have just like a strong union town, and so people are, particularly the Teamsters, are very concerned about if this takes off, like self-driving trucks will be next, that'll cost jobs, and so those unions have allies at the board of supervisors in San Francisco that are not a fan of self-driving cars. And also I think because it's more of an urban area, there's like more complexity. It's a harder problem. And so like for a while there was a lot of conflict with the San Francisco police fire department
Right.
because they were like blocking fire trucks. My sense is that has improved over time as they've kind of got better at it and they've listened to the SFFD, but it was definitely kind of touch and go for a while where it seemed like there was maybe going to be a backlash developing.
Yeah, I mean, also the smaller, like Phoenix is a very sprawled out metro area, very car friendly, very car dependent, sort of developed in the era of cars. I mean, San Francisco was built pre-cars.
Yeah.
When I was driving around when my wife Kate ran the Philly Marathon, it was exactly a year ago. Like I was trying to do this thing with the car where we would like go to a bunch of different locations with our kids to like cheer her on, and driving like through like narrow Philly streets, like looking for parking while everyone else is doing this is just like a nightmare, truly, because their streets are super narrow. So I can imagine that the distinct features of how dense an urban environment is could have real effects on how people are reacting to it and also what the car culture is there as well.
Yeah. And to your point from the previous episode you did about the life after cars kind of thinking, that's not a common feature, I think, of Phoenix politics. Like there's very few people who are like lobbying for no cars.
Right.
And so that kind of faction of politics just didn't exist. Whereas in San Francisco, it very much does. And so I think a lot of people who don't like self-driving cars, really, they just don't like cars.
Right.
And they think, well, this is a car, so I don't like this. Which I think is a little silly because like cars are not going to go away anytime soon. And anyway, but so when Cruise and Waymo were new in San Francisco, you had these activists who would go and put a cone on the hood of a car. And in the early years, that would confuse it enough that it would like prevent it from going anywhere. So yeah, you had some definite backlash to the technology of the first year or two of these companies operating in San Francisco.
Yeah, and so the ideological division seems to me like a salient one, and I think there's sort of, I want to kind of divide like legitimate concerns from things that I think are a little less legitimate. So the safety concern is obviously the first concern everyone would have, and I think is obviously the primary legitimate concern. Like, is this thing going to work? Is it going to kill people?
Yeah.
I don't think you can say like definitively that's no longer a problem, but I think you got to take seriously the data, which is that it's hard to object to them right now on safety grounds.
Yeah. For the Waymos, at least, we can maybe talk about some of the others, but I think Waymo's demonstrated a pretty strong safety record.
The other things that I can imagine, I mean, we could talk a little bit about sort of like car culture and what it would mean, but let's talk a bit, because since you invoked the labor thing, I mean, this strikes me as non-trivial. And again, this is something I'm really wrestling with in a way that I haven't ever before, partly because of what's happening with AI. And I've given riffs like this before on the podcast, but if you'll permit me, there's this argument in the sort of neoliberal era of free trade, right? A combination of questions about both automation and trade that were going to change the composition of jobs. They were going to make certain jobs either be automated away or move to places with cheaper labor. This would be an overall win-win. It would push out the productivity frontier. It would produce higher growth, in the aggregate, more revenue and income, a more prosperous society. There would be distributional problems. You could kind of deal with those distributional problems after the fact through redistribution. This was sort of the general neoliberal theory. And I think as economics, there's a lot to it. But I also think the social, institutional, political, geographical reality proved to be pretty brutal. Like, when the only factory in the town closes, that does something that's very hard to make up for with some kind of tax and transfer program that's going to give everybody their little share of the dividend that comes from free trade that closed the factory. And so when we think about, driving, we talk about the Teamsters, like there's like 3.5 million truck drivers in America. It's a job that you can, with a high school degree, make a 6-figure income. It seems to me like the ultimate application of this technology would be for that. There's also, I don't know how many Uber and taxi drivers there are in the country, but we're talking about a lot of jobs, and a lot of jobs for people that can make a decent income without a college degree, which is particularly important. Like, how do you think about this job question?
I mean, I think it's a serious question, and I'm certainly not going to tell anybody they shouldn't be concerned about it or they shouldn't be upset that their job might be going away. I think, given the safety concerns, I ultimately think this technology should be allowed to move forward because I don't think we saying that we should keep killing 40,000 people a year to save people's jobs really makes sense. The other thing that I hope policymakers think about is like we're a very divided country, and the red states are rolling out the red carpet for this technology. And I think it would be unfortunate if 5 years from now, the whole Sun Belt has self-driving cars everywhere. You're starting to see personally owned vehicles with self-driving capability. It's like kind of living in the future. And
Right.
like northeastern blue cities are like still like exactly the way they are now. I think that will kind of play into this sense that like blue cities are kind of poorly governed. It'll make it hard to
Mhm.
be like we're the moving to the future. As a resident of Washington D.C., which is like a very blue city, that's not the kind of future I want, and it's certainly not. I don't think that's going to be sustainable. Like once people see both the convenience and the increased safety of this technology in other states, I think there will be political pressure on blue cities and blue states to allow this. And I personally would rather see those cities get out ahead of it. But that's not at all to minimize. I guess the other thing I would say on the jobs front is I do think it will be. This isn't like a next year thing. We've been talking about how long it took to get to where we are now. It's going to take at least a decade, probably 20 years, to get to the point where like most vehicles are driverless, just because it just takes time to manufacture the vehicles. It takes time to build depots and cleaning and charging for the taxis, and then getting personally owned vehicles is another step. And the trucking is behind taxis. The first fully driverless truck rides just happened this year, and so it's going to take 5 or 10 years before I think you see 5 years. I think before you start to see kind of enough scale that is economically significant.
Is there interest investment in the trucking side of things though?
There are several startups. The leading company is called Aurora. They're operating in Texas between Dallas and Houston, and they're doing like a tiny number of rides. But yes, I think you're going to see a similar kind of pattern. They're going to start with Sunbelt. I think there's going to be like several ones inside Texas, and they'll go to Phoenix, things like that. And it'll take a few years, I think, to get up to scale. But yes, I would say in 10 years, I would expect there to be kind of a national network of fully driverless long haul trucks. I think you'll also see I think some of the trucking jobs will change. Like one of the models that some of these trucking companies are exploring is to have a human driver drive like from the warehouse to some kind of local distribution point, and then the
Right.
driver gets out and the car drives itself on the freeway, and then you have somebody on the other side. And so in some ways, I could actually see this be a good story for truck drivers in that it transforms the job from something where you're away from your family for days
Right.
to something where you do 2 or 3 jobs in a day. You maybe help unload or do paperwork, and you get to go home to your family. Obviously, that's not good if a couple of years later you lose your job altogether. But I could see the job in some cases evolving where it becomes a little less brutal, a little more compatible with spending time with your family.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good point because on the other yeah, so I've seen that too, this idea of truck driving becomes like solving the last mile problem, and then specifically dealing with, the thing we were just talking about. There's a whole set of human things you have to do when you like show up to give the delivery, right? So like,
Yeah.
and like it's hard to think of automating that entirely, particularly in, particularly if you're in an urban environment and, you got to coordinate with people and you got to get out of the truck and be like, where should we put this? Oh, this is blocked, etc. But that second point you made is kind of a profound one. I think it's worth sitting with for a while when we think about automation more broadly, right? Which is lots of jobs that go away because of automation are pretty brutal jobs. Like, that in factory work, like very repetitive, backbreaking, laborious jobs, getting automated by, robots and engineering. And there's a loss there, but then sometimes there's always the question of like, right, but would it be better if we had like a human being like lifting this over and over? Like, it seems hard to come up with that as the answer as well. And truck driving, lots of people drive truck and love driving truck, but it's also can be a really brutal job.
Yeah, I mean, when you hear the Trump administration talk about this in the other direction, that we want to bring back our T-shirt manufacturing jobs or our furniture making jobs, it's like I don't think very many people like aspire to have to like get back some of those jobs that got exported to other. It was rough for the people that lost those jobs, but those are usually not the highest paid or most prestigious jobs, and in many cases, people
Or
after the
rewarding.
transition period ended up in kind of situations they like better.
I mean, Howard Lutnick said that your child and your grandchild are going to work in the same factory making dolls. This is an actual thing by somebody, the Commerce Secretary of the United States. Like, look down the barrel 80 years and your grandkid is going to be made. Like, what are you talking about? When you talk about this sort of red-blue divide, I mean, part of it's weather, right? I mean, it does seem to me that's a big part of this. Like the Sun Belt thing is you want to do this where there's no winter and it's dry, because that just massively removes variables, right? I mean, that seems like a huge part of it.
That's a big part of it, yes. Yeah, yes, that's a big part of why it started mostly in red states, and then California, which does have nice weather, so that's a big reason California's the main blue state that they've rolled out in so far.
Are there noises? Are there already preparations? When you said rolling out the red carpet in places, like Atlanta, for instance, which Waymo is now moving to, and Austin has been a hub for this, and Tesla is now doing their self-driving. We could talk about that, which seems, it seems not to be as mature a technology, to put it gently, as the Waymo version. Is there already preparation in sort of Democratic cities controlled by the Democratic Party, coded as liberal cities, to keep Waymo out? Like, are we already seeing that, or is this speculative on your part?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say it's so much there's efforts to keep it out. I would say current law does not allow self-driving cars in several.
Oh, it's just the default.
Cities.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Washington, D.C., New York, Boston, and Seattle, I believe, are all cities that it would require legislation or action by the executive to approve self-driving vehicles. Here in Washington, D.C., there's one of the local there's a bill that has been proposed, has not gotten floor time or whatever you want to call it, and they're waiting on a report from the Department of Transportation, and that report has been waiting for several years, and it's kind of like everybody's kind of passing the buck. It's not clear there's any like active opposition, but they don't have to actively oppose it. They just have to not do anything, and it's not allowed. And I think DC is interesting because DC is probably the warmest kind of blue city. And it is a city where Waymo has said they would like to launch a service next year. And so they're like, they're actively testing. I see them around here all the time. And so that's, I think, the clearest case where Waymo would like to go there. They've asked, they've been lobbying, and so far the city council has not allowed it. I would say Boston is the most extreme case where they're not that close partly because of the weather. But they've done a little bit of mapping and early testing, and the city council held this hearing where they had some Waymo people came and they raked them over the coals, and were like very upset about this idea and are considering legislation that would like explicitly ban. It would require a driver in every vehicle, which basically is a ban of driverless technology. And so they're moving the other direction. I believe the state legislature is also considering legislation in that direction. They haven't actually passed that yet, and so I think Massachusetts law is a little bit ambiguous, but I think to do it at scale, Waymo really wants to have affirmative legislation. Like Texas and Florida have bills that very clearly say there's like this one permit you need to get, and once you get that, you're kind of good for the whole state.
Right.
California has,
but it's still monitored and regulated, right? I mean, you can't just like presumably I couldn't announce tomorrow like Chris Hayes's bespoke. Like, I'm going to put someone's got to be like checking who, like one company gets the license, or
I haven't looked at it super carefully. I think there's some kind of basic stuff. You probably need insurance, and you need to fill out a form explaining what you're going to do. But I think Texas and Florida are pretty permissive. I would say California is the best kind of middle example where they do have a pretty rigorous system. I think if a blue city or state were thinking about wanting to legalize in kind of a safety conscious way, California is a good model, because first you have to do testing with safety drivers. You have to do it for a certain amount of time. And then a geographically limited area, and then once the regulators are convinced it's safe, then there's a second process where you say, okay, now can I do a driverless? And then there's a separate agency that has to allow charging passengers. So you can have a system. I would say 10 years ago, the liberal cities that were thinking about this were thinking about it from a safety perspective. We need to have rules for making sure this is safe and monitoring. And like you were saying, I think the new thing is you have a new crop of more kind of union aligned things. They're just like, this is a bad idea, we want to shut it down.
Right.
And the debate in blue cities is between the like California approach, which is we need some regulation for safety, but we want to allow this to happen, and the like emerging maybe Boston approach of like, we just don't like this, we don't want to allow it no matter how safe it is.
You mentioned something before about the Phoenix example, right, where you don't have a huge like post-car culture or anti-car culture vibe there, and I think that's probably true. Although I'm sure there's people listening to this in the Phoenix area who are like, no, we do. um, so the next question to me, let's say we take seriously this idea of full automation or automation becoming more and more common. And I have a new car now that it doesn't have full self-driving, but each iteration of the private consumer vehicles you buy have more sophisticated technology in that direction. It's actually pretty amazing. How good it has gotten, even in just like the late model car that we just recently acquired. I think there's two really interesting questions to think about. One is what it does to the role of the car if it does become automated in this way. So I can see like one level is we're just going to have a lot more cars, and more cars is bad. And because cars are these big hulking things that take up space and they ruin urban environments, there's an emissions question. Although if we're doing them electric cars and they're being powered in a carbon-free way, that takes care of that. But it seems to me there's another possibility, which is particularly in urban environments, if you have like reliable, cheap, automated cars that you can hail, that people have to have cars less. That maybe the car ownership goes down if like you can just get on the app and this thing brings you the grocery store and then you load the groceries in. And like you can do that with Uber now. Uber's really expensive. It was cheap for a very long time. It's really expensive. That's a very high price to pay for your groceries. But part of the value proposition here, right, Timothy, is like if it's automated and they're getting really good at this, like it could be pretty darn cheap.
Yeah, I think that's right. So right now, a Waymo costs about the same as an Uber or Lyft. In a city like San Francisco, maybe a little more expensive because it's kind of a premium experience. Because it's new, the technology is still pretty expensive, like the chips and the sensors and stuff. But it's like one of the most predictable things in the world is that like electronic stuff gets cheaper over time. And so I would expect once this technology gets ubiquitous, that stuff will get cheaper. And the cost of a taxi is about half the wages of the driver. And so in the long run, I would expect a driverless taxi ride to be on the order of half the cost of a conventional taxi, which would be a big difference. I think there's probably a lot of people in a city like New York or Washington, D.C. who are on that margin where if you cut the cost of taxis at half, they'd be like, all right, maybe I don't need a car anymore. I could downgrade from 2 cars to 1 car.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think that's absolutely a possibility. And it could have some great kind of second order effects. I mean, I'm very interested in kind of land use, housing issues. And one of the big sources of opposition to new housing is, well, it's going to take up more parking. If it's easier to have either apartments that don't get parking or just generally the parking becoming less scarce, that could help with a lot with that, which would then maybe create a kind of a flywheel where as density increases, more people want taxis. And so things get better. The other thing, the other reason I'm somewhat optimistic about this is that I think the ultimate solution to these kind of congestion issues is congestion pricing, which is really difficult to implement when you have individually owned vehicles, because to do it in a really rigorous way, you need to have some way of monitoring people. You either need cameras, which that gets civil liberties on edge, or you need to have some kind of tracking device in your car, which gets people even more freaked out. But if you're already taking a taxi ride and you already are getting a bill, it wouldn't be that hard to either have restrictions, say this kind of vehicle can't go in this part of the city, or to add a congestion fee to say, during this time of the day, we add, $1 to your fare. And so I think the optimistic story is that it actually makes it, it allows congestion management to happen much better. That maybe if you want to, ride a taxi to work at rush hour, that's going to be expensive. So people hopefully will take transit, but off hours, it might be really cheap. The way there used to be with cell phones, there's like nights and weekends plans. Maybe it's super cheap to take a taxi ride, outside of kind of high demand times. And so people who want to save money, maybe go to work early or go to work late. So I think there's possibilities like that. In the long run, it could also be, there's no reason there couldn't be driverless buses or some kind of driverless shuttle that's like somewhere between a bus and a taxi.
Yeah.
And so there could be new kind of transportation options. I think also like delivery, like a lot of people's driving is to go to the store and get a carton of milk, but maybe there's a little robot that takes the milk to you, which would be both cheaper and potentially, you could use a bike lane or something, go a little
Right.
slower and not take up much space. So I think there's going to be,
Yeah, that's a
I
good
think this is
point.
going to have profound impacts on the way cities are designed. Now, on the flip side, it is absolutely true. There's also going to be some people who are like, well, now I can live 2 hours outside the city because I could, do my email while going into the
Right.
city. And so we'll have to think about, do we want to, allow a lot more development way out there? Do we want to have some other kind of, but maybe I guess I'm not that worried about that. But if somebody really is opposed to sprawl, that absolutely will be something I think will happen.
That last point raises exactly the next issue I wanted to talk about, which is it's interesting to think about the design revolution that happens in the automobile if it's not a thing that you drive.
Mhm.
And I thought of this because there's a new startup called Zoox that has a little pilot program that they're operating in Vegas. And what was interesting to me about these driverless cars, and I think they're very geofenced. There's only like a few locations they're going between, although that seems like kind of the perfect place to do this. Take me from the Bellagio to the MGM or whatever. It seems like you can get that down pretty well. That these cars, the Waymo is just a consumer vehicle without a driver, and the steering wheel even moves, which gives it that kind of like weird ghostly feel to it.
Yeah.
These are just cars they're kind of like self-contained little pods. It looks like something you might, if you went to like a zoo and the zoo had a, tram operating that showed you a bunch of animals, it kind of feels like that. It's got two benches facing each other. And when I saw that, I was like, oh, right. If you don't have a driver, everything about what a vehicle looks like from a design perspective, all of a sudden now becomes kind of negotiable, like in a really interesting way.
Yeah, totally. So the Zoox vehicle. So Zoox actually, it's been around for it was actually one of the first generation of one of the views that made it because they got bought by Amazon in 2000. So they've been around for a while, but they just started kind of showing their stuff in the last couple of years. And like you said, they've begun testing in Vegas and I think the Bay Area just this year. And one of the fun things about that vehicle is that it's symmetrical. And so if it's going one direction and wants to go the other way, it doesn't have to turn around. It can just go the other way because there's like no front to it. And the people, everybody like faces towards the middle.
That's so cool. I hadn't thought of that. Right. Yeah. You never have to do a U-turn if just make a symmetrical vehicle.
Yeah. So that's one thing about that. And yeah, I absolutely think in the long run, there's going to be a lot more diversity of vehicles. So yeah, one thing you could imagine is say you've got a cabin 4 or 5 hours away from home. Maybe you get in the car that has a bed in it and you go to sleep and you wake up and you're at your cabin. I think you're going to have like Tesla, they're building the Cybercab. That's just a little 2-seat vehicle that's going to have no steering wheel. And so I could imagine some urban cars getting much smaller because when you buy a vehicle, maybe most of the time you're just commuting in it, but occasionally, you want to have your whole family and, go camping or something. But if you have these vehicles that are custom designed just to be taxis, just in a certain area, certain number of those trips, maybe you don't have to go more than 25 miles an hour. Maybe you only need one passenger. And so maybe there's some smaller vehicles. And then when you need to go somewhere else, you can, rent a minivan or something. And so I think the design space of possible vehicle designs is going to change a lot. And then like I was saying before, like I think delivery is going to be a big thing. Like I think this is going to change retail a lot in the same way that like the invention of the automobile allowed the creation of stores like Target and Walmart that really didn't make sense in like a pre-automobile world. I think the creation of self-driving cars will create new retail models where you don't go to the store because the stuff comes to you. And I think figuring out like, do those go on the sidewalk? Do they go on a bike lane? Do they go on a street with like a full-size vehicle? Do they do like one trip per passenger, or is there a vehicle with a bunch of stuff in it and you like, it like makes a bunch of stops? So those kind of questions will be worked out, and especially for urban areas where like space is at a premium, I think there's gonna be a lot of debates. Like, do we want robots in the bike lane? DoorDash just introduced a vehicle that goes like 20 miles an hour and is like smaller than a car, but like significant in size, designed to go in a bike lane. And I haven't heard yet if there's kind of
DoorDash
feelings about that.
An autonomous vehicle.
Yeah, they have an autonomous vehicle that's like the size of like a microwave baby that goes up to 20 miles an hour. It's like small enough it will fit in a bike lane, but it's designed to be small enough it can like go into apartment buildings. And because until now there's been a few like
I'm sorry. I have to say it because there's some part of me, and I just think it might be I can't tell if it's middle age, which is possible, or it's like the experience of the kind of dark dystopian turn that a lot of like tech has taken, and particularly the politics of tech world, where like I think 30 years ago, I would have been like, whoa, that's so cool. Like, oh,
Mhm.
neat. There's a little autonomous vehicle that's going to bring you your burrito. And now I'm like completely creeped out by the idea.
They're very cute. They've got these big like cartoon eyes. They've got
Yes,
these two little screens that can show
I've
you.
seen them. Yes.
So I don't know. I mean, they're trying to make them as non-threatening as possible. But until these came along, there were like sidewalk robots that were small and slow, and on-street robots that were like close to car-sized and like fast. And they're trying to do this middle thing anyway. So I think that kind of question of like, where do we want the robots? Do we want to allow them? How do they interact with other vehicles? Is going to be like a huge debate over the next 10 or 15 years.
Yeah, and when you put it that way, it's not just okay, get rid of the windshield and what can a car look like if you don't need a driver. For instance, it could be symmetrical, which is super cool. But if an autonomous vehicle can be designed around whatever the specific purpose for it is, it could be the size of a shoebox up to a Mack truck and everything in between, and could go in different places and have different capabilities, all for different uses, something that wasn't possible before because you had to fit the human in the front and basically get like enough use out of that huge hunk of steel.
Yeah, and I think it'll be a while before we see this for passenger vehicles because the regulations will have to be rewritten. Zoox had a lot of problems getting approval for its vehicle because there's a law that specifies what the steering wheel has to look like, and there's not an option of like no steering wheel. And so they just recently got the Trump administration to agree that they can have a vehicle with no steering wheel. But if you wanted to make like a radically different car, you probably will need to kind of rewrite those regulations,
Right.
And demonstrate that we care about safety. And so like a sleeping car, you'd have to figure out like what do you do with an airbag if it's like right. So I think there's a lot of questions, and I think this is something that probably will take a long time to figure out. So there's probably like a 10 to 20 year thing out thing. But once a large share of vehicles are driverless, absolutely Waymo's going to be thinking, and other companies will be thinking about how are we going to redesign these cars to serve passengers better.
I think there's also going to be there's a really interesting ethical question. I mean, if I think about it, if you look at the Waymo data and you think about it, it just seems understandable why computers would be safer drivers than humans. In the same way that like you could program a robot to just hit every 3-pointer that it takes because it's got it's incredibly precise calculations. It knows exactly the force and the arc that it needs. And even the best shooter can't quite do that.
Yeah.
If, to the degree that this spreads and to the degree that autonomous driving continues to demonstrate that it is considerably safer, there comes a point where there's like a real ethical question about whether you let people drive their cars, which is a non-trivial one because tens of thousands of people die every year in car crashes.
Yeah. So I think this is going to be a very gradual thing. I mean, even just the fastest possible thing is it takes about 20 years for a vehicle a useful life of a vehicle is 20 years. So even if every new vehicle were driverless tomorrow, it's going to be 20 years before it would be possible to say like every vehicle has to be driverless. So this is going to be a multi-decade kind of debate. But I think the thing you'll start to see is that right now we're very reluctant to take away the right to drive. If somebody is getting old enough that they're no longer able to do it safely, or somebody gets a DUI. Eventually, I think if you get enough DUIs, you'll get your license taken away. But judges are very reluctant to do that because their livelihood might depend on it.
Yeah, I mean, per that Life After Cars episode, if you're in West Texas without a car, like you're screwed. You can't do anything. You can't go to school. You can't work. You can't do anything.
Yeah, but as cars become more self-driving, like as taxis get cheaper, and then eventually as you can own a driverless vehicle, I think it'll be much easier for the judge to issue an order that say you're not allowed to drive anymore.
Yeah.
You can ride in a driverless vehicle. You might be able to own one that's like has the you drive it function disabled. But I think hopefully that'll be something that's like not as polarizing. I think actually banning people from driving their cars is going to be very controversial, and hopefully actually I think the optimistic view would be that maybe have advanced enough safety features that the car maybe will prevent you from crashing in most cases. And the other vehicles maybe the vehicles will be able to tell, oh, this is a human driver, we're going to give him extra space. And so I'm not sure we'll ever literally get to the point. And then the other trend we've seen is we've made it harder and harder to get a driver's license. There's more driver ed and stuff. And so maybe that continues to get harder and harder, and it'll become like Audio Machine Gun or something. Was technically you could do that, but there's a log trying to get a licensing program, and it'll just be like a hobby that you need to or be like a pilot. You can be a pilot, but there's hundreds of hours of training you need to do. Maybe like driving a car will be like that, but it'll just gradually get harder and harder as the like driverless version gets better and more affordable.
In terms of the competitive landscape, like Waymo seems to have a huge advantage right now. Tesla has self-driving. They're using a different model, like from the engineering side. Waymo, if you've seen Waymo cars, they don't look like a normal car. They're outfitted with a whole bunch of additional sensors. The Tesla self-driving car is just a Tesla, right? It doesn't have additional like hardware or physical features.
Yeah, that's right. They just use cameras to tell what's going around, and like every Tesla since 2016 has shipped with a certain number of cameras that Elon Musk at least claims is sufficient to achieve full self-driving.
And they are now operating self-driving taxis in Austin, right?
They're operating in Austin and the Bay Area, but they have a Tesla employee in every vehicle. In Austin, it's in the passenger seat with like an emergency stop button.
Okay.
In California, due to regulation, the person's behind the wheel.
Okay.
But Elon says that they're going to take those people out of the vehicle by the end of the year, which I'm a little skeptical about. But yeah, right now they're operating at a small scale. I think they have a few dozen vehicles across Austin and the Bay Area, whereas Waymo has more than 2,000 vehicles. So right now Waymo's like 50 to 100 times the scale. But like Elon is a very hustly kind of guy. So if he does get the technology figured out, it would not shock me if Waymo has this lead for several years, but then they kind of squander it because they're like a little bureaucratic and Waymo kind of catches up. But right now I think Tesla is clearly behind in terms of the capabilities of their software.
Yeah, and then is there anyone? I mean, it seems to me Waymo is really far above everyone in terms of scale and technology sophistication. And then the flywheel that you said before, which is the more data you have, the better your models are going to get at learning, and the better they get at learning, the safer they're going to be, and the more that you'll be able to demonstrate to new cities and regulators that it's safe, and your cost curve starts to come down. Like, I guess the question is like, do you see this as a site of competition, or does it look to you like this kind of winner take all market where Waymo has a huge advantage?
Waymo definitely has a huge lead in the U.S. What you mentioned before, Zoox, I would say they're the third main contender for the U.S. market. They are similarly behind Waymo, but they are backed by Amazon, so they have the money. A lot of these companies just ran out of money because it takes billions of dollars, but Amazon has plenty of money.
Yeah.
I would say, but the other big competitor to Waymo is the Chinese companies. There's several companies in China. I would say there's probably 3 or 4 major self-driving companies that are within striking distance of where Waymo is. And so obviously they're going to win the Chinese market. We're probably not going to let them operate here, but the rest of the world, there's going to be a competition between Waymo and 1 or 2 Chinese companies that have the kind of leading technology. And I think that's going to be the big source of Waymo's competition is like, can they convince companies in Europe and Latin America and Africa and Asia to adopt their tech, or will people take the Chinese ones? And, China has a big manufacturing advantage. They're very, very good at electric cars. This is true beyond self-driving, just electric vehicles in general. Chinese companies are growing very quickly in terms of market share. And so, I think one of the big questions is like, can Waymo get the cost of this technology down quickly enough that they're competitive globally in countries that, we're not going to, like I said, we're not going to let China run our self-driving cars,
right.
But there's lots of other countries that maybe were like neutral. You think about Brazil or India or something. Well, no, not India, but Brazil, for example. Like I think they probably would be happy to have either Chinese or American vehicles. And so it's going to be more about like cost and features. And given how good China is at manufacturing, they may be able to just like undercut us on price.
Yeah, they seem to have automation pretty figured out over there, just generally speaking. Timothy Lee is a reporter who's written about technology, economics, and public policy for more than a decade. I've known him during that time. He's creator of Understanding AI. It's a newsletter all about developments in the AI world. That was great, Tim. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me on again.